Hi everybody, my name is Mike Ryan, and we're talking to you today about reverse engineering the Nintendo 64 SIC. A little bit about us. I really like to play video games.
My name is Marshall, and I've had a lot of interest in Nintendo 64 specifically for a long time, so it's been really great that these two people have helped me make it happen. I'm just a video game enthusiast.
This guy's the PM. He's taking all the credit though.
Hi, my name is John McMaster. I run siliconprawn.org and am a general hardware enthusiast and like working with computer chips.
All right, so before we get too into the technical content of what we're talking about today, I want to give you guys a little brief history of the video game industry and the motivations and the forces that led to the creation of the SIC. So back in the early 1980s, Atari was a very popular video game company. They released some very excellent games. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Pong and Nintendo's original Donkey Kong. And everything was going really well for them until around 1983 or so, when the market became flooded with just absolute garbage games. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with the story of E.T. A whole bunch of cartridges ended up in a landfill somewhere out in New Mexico. A lot of us thought this was an apocryphal story. So there was an art project last year that went out and exhumed some of those, and it turns out that yes, indeed, the landfill was absolutely loaded with trash games. And this did not work out well for Atari or for the home video game market. You can see it takes a major dive starting around 1983, and then at 1986, the very bottom of the market was everybody had thought the video game industry was dead. Meanwhile, Nintendo was having massive success in Japan with their Famicom, and they wanted to bring it to the United States. Hiroshi Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo, believed that Atari failed because they allowed anybody and everybody to publish games for their platform. They didn't do any quality control whatsoever. So he believed that there had to be some sort of a technical mitigation for this, a technical means of preventing people from making unauthorized games for the system. And it really all boiled down to this. So when you went out to the market, if you were a kid in the 80s, and you bought a Nintendo game and it had this seal on it, you were reasonably sure that you were getting a pretty good game. So the technical means by which Nintendo accomplished this was the SIC.
Now, what the SIC is part of a system to basically enforce licensing directly from Nintendo. So what happens is, it's like you have a SIC chip in the console and then one in the game, and then they talk to each other when you start the game. So they're always talking just constantly, so that if anything happens, it just resets itself. And anyone who has an NES knows they are very, very, very flaky. This is one of the reasons. Because of the bad cartridge connector, it usually wouldn't make good contact. And for the Super Nintendo, it was pretty much the same story. They just took the same chip, they shrunk it down a little bit, problem solved. So there's not much difference there. Now, there were pirate games for the NES, and there's a couple of ways that they did this. It was pretty interesting, I think. The picture on the top there is part of the game circuit board, and there is no lockout chip. Instead, there is a boost regulator, which is just a circuit that generates very large negative spiked voltage, and it goes, and then instead of talking to the chip, it just punches it in the mouth and then shuts it up.
Wow.
So it's definitely not kosher. It did work. Some of the times, it just kills your console.
Nintendo actually released a console revision that had some inline resistors that prevented this. And some of these game manufacturers actually sent out manuals that said how to open up your console and clip the pin on the SIC that enabled it. That's how desperate these companies were to make games for this system.
Right, because the licensing costs were very prohibitive. You could make money, but you did have to work very hard for it. And on the bottom is a actual clone made by Tengen, which is actually Atari. They just made a shell company so that they could sneakily get away with stuff like this.
So this is actually a pretty interesting story. Some of the people in this room might be familiar with it. So at the time, Atari was attempting to reverse engineer this chip using invasive chip methods. So they tried to get inside the die package and remove the die and then figure out how the chip worked. In the meantime, somebody inside Atari decided to go to the copyright office and file a bogus copyright claim to get the source code to Nintendo's original 10NES chip. And then they produced a perfectly functional clone using this. This is pretty illegal. And Nintendo sued them for that, and Atari ended up having to pay them a whole bunch of money. However, the interesting outcome of this lawsuit was that one of the district court judges noted that the reverse engineering process, assuming Atari had not stolen the code, actually qualifies as a fair use. So we've got a pretty rock solid case here that what we're doing is fair use under copyright law.
Right, so let's just skipping to Nintendo 64 now. We're done with all that older stuff. Now, they basically took the same system that worked for them on the older stuff, and they tweaked it a little bit, modernized it just slightly, just enough for it to be different. And then, so here's a block diagram of the N64. I'm not going to talk about how it does the game graphics and stuff like that. What's inside the yellow rectangle is the protection system. Same deal. These two chips are talking to each other from the moment you turn the game on until you turn it off, always talking to each other. But instead of being two symmetrical things, executing in lockstep, the PIF is just, they rolled it into a chip that handles all the system bring up and pulling the controllers and the interrupts, the resets, and all that sort of thing. So here's an actual game cartridge. This is a legitimate one. So the chip on the left is the lockout chip. It looks exactly the same. They're made by Sharp. It's just the more modern iteration, I suppose. Now I should say, unlike the older Nintendo stuff, instead of having very widespread pirate chips, this pirate game is actually very, very, very rare. If you actually have one of these and you're willing to donate in the name of science, we'd actually really like to see what's inside those.
There's a very small number of pirate games made in Hong Kong that have this chip, and we have very little information about the history of this pirated SIC. So again, please let us know if you have any leads on these.
Continuing our talk about dubious legality, this is how you would pirate games. Basically, it has a bunch of RAM inside, this piece on the bottom. The top part is the N64, if you aren't familiar with it. It reads games off CD drives, and then it did not have any sort of way to emulate or copy the lockout chip. So what you had to do was, in the cartridge slot in the top, you would insert a real game, and it would connect just the lockout chip, so it would fool it into running. Now, here are a couple flash cartridges that let you run homebrew and do sorts of development on with modern technology.
And really, that's what this is all about. The SIC made sense perhaps 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when Nintendo actually was making considerable money off these consoles. But nowadays, we want to be able to do homebrew development and actually use them for interesting purposes. And the SIC is just getting in the way of what we consider a very reasonable use of the hardware. So not only ourselves, but earlier projects also started looking into cloning the earlier chips.
Right. And if you were to take the lid off one of these older protection chips, we have these swapped around. This is actually the older NES and Super NES lockout chip. This is basically showing you the existing efforts to clone them, which they have accomplished. And we haven't accomplished that for our current development tools for the Nintendo 64, which is what we're going to do in this talk. So that's what this talk is about. I'm not sure if we actually explained that in the beginning. Here you go.
Good job presenting, team.
Yes. So, unlike the older Nintendos, where they had one lockout chip for, like 6 or 7 years, Nintendo got a little bit smarter, and throughout the lifespan of the console, they would periodically introduce new lockout chips just to stay ahead of the pirates by a few months, so they'd have to, figure the new secrets out. So there are 6 variants per region, and then there NTSC, which is Americas, Japan, and some other things, and then the rest of the world, basically. So it made it much harder and more difficult to pirate. There were some special cases, like this is a arcade board. It's a JAMA board that plugs into an arcade cabinet, has a Nintendo chipset, and they just have the game plugs into some sort of custom connector. Just a different, a special case
But
lockout chip.
And yeah, this even the arcade hardware had the same exact lockout chip. It's labeled as a 5101, but it's actually running identical code to the 6101 NTSC chip.
So at this point, we know what the chip does. We don't know how it does it. If you were to look at what the chip does physically, look with the logic analyzer or something, you will just see a stream of zeros and ones, and it's completely random. You can log it for days and days. It will never repeat. You don't know how it works. So what we did is we switched to, we started to get to know John McMaster here for a little while, and who's working with Andrew Zonenberg, who just gave a talk. What they do is they use very dangerous chemicals, and they just get right in there onto the chip and then see exactly what's going on. So I'm going to turn it over to him. He's going to explain exactly the mad science he used to look inside.
Hey there. So while these guys were cowering behind their laptops in their cubicles, I was out in the trenches getting my hands dirty. So let's talk a little bit about what that involves and what we got out of it. So Andrew is apparently going to get bored to death by this slide, but we're going to beat the dead horse a little bit, just with one slide. So the first part of this process for actually getting to the die and extracting information is to actually open up the chip and expose it by removing the epoxy that's basically blocking access to the chip. Unfortunately, at the time, I was having trouble getting some of the chemicals that I wanted to use. So the very first step for me, which is shown on the left, is that I actually distilled the nitric acid that I wanted to use to decap the chip. So once I got that, we move over to the right. Now, normally the way that I would do this is maybe with a heat gun and a little small test tube just to decap one chip. As we'll see later, though, this process had some issues where I had to kind of play around with it a little bit. So I've actually decapping a bunch of chips at the same time. Unfortunately, this reaction is very exothermic. That is, puts off a lot of heat and actually can explode if you don't monitor it carefully. So for here, I put it in a water bath, and that kind of makes it, keeps it under control and makes sure I don't have to get a new eye or something. The other big problem, too, is if you notice there's this kind of red gas building up in there. And this red gas is actually rather unpleasant to breathe. So the second notable part of the setup, which is kind of in the background there, is there's some tubes that feed it through what's called a scrubber unit that actually makes it so very little of this very red, unpleasant gas gets released in this process. Once that's done, once that completes, you get something that looks like this. I think this is some Xilinx FPGA of sorts, but the same sort of idea. You get this kind of tangled mess of bond wires and silicon, the bond wires being the gold wires that connect from the plastic package you're used to seeing on circuit boards down to the actual silicon die. This makes it difficult to clean, it makes it very unstable on microscope stages, and leads to a number of other problems. So we really need a way to rip those suckers off and just get the bare die. So the first way to do this, which is what a lot of people do, is actually just to take tweezers and very carefully under a microscope, pull these guys off one by one. And that's what I did initially, and it works okay. But if you want to do a bunch of these, it really doesn't scale well, and it's just kind of a soul-crushing process. Maybe soothing for some people. But you also can risk scratching the die. If your tweezer slips, you can gouge it and maybe crack the die in half if you're really sloppy. Just want to avoid that if possible. Additionally, this yanking process is pretty brutal, and you'll actually take chunks out of the die sometimes. Not necessarily a problem, but it looks kind of ugly. So after looking around a little bit, I saw that there were a few other methods that people use for stuff like this. One of them is actually take mercury and use that to dissolve the gold on the die, just like the gold miners would do. Mercury, even by my standards, I decided, I don't really want to deal with that if I don't have to. Looked into it, and hot solder seems to work just about as well. Not exactly the greatest chemical either, but a little bit better than mercury. So if you look on the left, you can see a ball bond on a chip, and on the right, after applying some solder to this, what it's done is it's basically just dissolved the gold wire. We have the bond pad, which is a little bit distorted from the ball bonding process, which is a kind of high pressure mechanical process. But otherwise, we have basically a perfectly functional bond pad, and it's very clean the way it turns out. So once we get to this point, we've got a bare die, and we need to start extracting information from it. So I looked into the market for getting a full computer-controlled microscope, And unfortunately, it's, very expensive. So what I did instead was kind of hobbled something together from a bunch of pieces collected basically across the U.S. So the microscope body itself came from Craigslist. The motor controllers came from the school dumpsters. The laptop came from a surplus shop, and the list kind of goes on. Everything's kind of hobbled together, and somehow it kind of managed to make a working system. Basically, the way that it works is there's a lamp house which shines light onto the die. The objectives, actually do the magnification. And then the motors go through an ARM processor that I wrote some very crude but effective C code. That goes over to a USB serial interface to the laptop on the lower left corner. That runs some Python as well as a camera driver I wrote for the microscope camera. And that's able to take pictures from the USB camera and then send commands to the ARM processor to issue step commands to move the stage one bit at a time. And that's how I produce the images that are later used for analysis. Okay, so at this point, we were able to get some top metal images of the chip, the highest layers. But unfortunately for this project, that was not enough. We were looking for the ROM, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, the actual firmware in this device. But we couldn't see it. We could see some metal traces and a little bit below. But we had to go a little bit deeper, to get the information that we're looking for. So basically, this process is called delayering. And essentially what you're doing is removing the silicon dioxide and the metal that are on those upper layers. Silicon dioxide is essentially the supporting material that holds everything together. And the first thing to do is to use a hydrofluoric acid, which you can get through a number of kind of home rust cleaner products. Don't try this at home, by the way. And use that to dissolve it. Unfortunately, this had a few big problems. The first is that it's somewhat uneven, which I'll talk about later, causes some real problems. And the second is that it leaves this aluminum fluoride residue. And that's going to deposit some gunk on the die that's going to cause some other later problems. After a little bit of researching, looking through some failure analysis books, the general recommendation is to use so-called buffered oxide etch. And the idea is that you add ammonium fluoride, which is, a buffer. That is, it keeps the pH more constant. And therefore, as the acid kind of gets depleted on some parts of the chip, the buffer will help kind of replenish it to the original concentration and keep it a lot more even across the chip, even as some parts start to etch a little bit quicker to begin with. And the second part is that I used a vortexer, which is basically a glorified mixer, and kind of just shakes it around and goes into seizures. And also use a heat gun that's temperature controlled, not exactly your standard Home Depot one. And that way everything is very temperature controlled. It's kind of sloshing around, which keeps everything well mixed. And so far that seems to give pretty good results. All right, so now we run into a little bit of a roadblock. So if you look at the top, what we have is we call a NOR active programmed ROM. That's off the Motorola 68K. That's the microcode. And it's very plainly visible. Basically, you can see some squiggles, and essentially, squiggle means 1 and no squiggle means 0. And that's great because, after some amount of effort, we can use CV or, manually type it out, whatever, and recover that into the microcode. On the bottom, though, we see the sort of equivalent structure off of this CIC chip, and we don't really see anything. It's kind of a blank slate. There's a little bit of dots here and there, but that's basically just, dust and other garbage on the die. So at this point, we're a little bit stumped, well, what can we do? So then it turns out, if you look a little bit more through some failure analysis books, you find upon something called dash etch, and there's some other alternatives, but this seems to be the most standard. And this basically gets you from the image on the left under the microscope to the image on the right under the microscope. And on the right now, we have very clear, concise bits that aren't too bad to image. So with that in mind, let's go through this process because although they made it sound pretty easy in the books, it turns out it's fairly involved to actually get good results. So first, a little bit of background. So basically what we're doing is these semiconductor chips have a positive and negative doping, which is, what actually makes these transistors work. They add small impurities like boron or phosphorus to the silicon in very small quantities. Now, what it turns out we can do is we use hydrofluoric acid, just like we did for delayering, to destroy the silicon dioxide. We also can use an oxidizer, such as nitric acid, to actually turn the silicon substrate into silicon dioxide. And if we use both of those at the same time, we get a competing reaction where some of the chemistry is creating silicon dioxide and some of the chemistry is taking it away. And it turns out that if you have thin layers of an optical transparent material, such as silicon dioxide, you actually get thin film interference, just like soapy bubbles. You see the rainbowy colors? We're talking about, the same sort of effect here. And so if we do this, we actually can create crests and valleys, such as the SEM image that some guy named Andrew took. I think that is the Cool Runner 2. And you can see some areas are a little bit lower and some are a little bit higher. And of course, that also shows up on an optical microscope as well as a SEM. So once again, basic procedure is, maybe 10 or 15 minutes of etching. It's actually rather quick. Failure analysis books recommend that you put a strong light on it, like the lights that are blinding me from the audience members. And unfortunately, I haven't really seen much changes when I've put a strong light, but that's what people recommend. Unfortunately, I ran into quite a few snags, which we're going to go through. And the last unfortunate point that you'll find is because you really are etching away the chip, if you don't get it right the first time, you basically lose the data. So it's definitely good to have, kind of figure out what you're doing. So the first issue you run into is that there's process variation. And what that means is that some chips are actually made, smaller over time. You hear about 65 nanometer or 22 nanometer chips, right? There's kind of this shrinking over time. Now we're dealing at a much larger scale, but it's basically the same idea. The other part is that these chip manufacturers will actually vary the chemistry used. So for example, this we generally will call the silicon dioxide. Well, it's not really that simple. Sometimes it's thermally grown, sometimes it's spin on glass. All these sort of variations of essentially what you're trying to get is the same sort of chemistry. And that all affects, the way that chip is going to etch and give you your final product. So fortunately for this chip, there are these old sports games which basically nobody loves. Their favorite sports guy, for 1 year, but after 10 years, no one really remembers them, and they're dirt cheap on eBay. So I was able to get a big pile of these to play with, and that was great because I didn't just have one try to get it right. We can go a few rounds and iterate. So the next issue that you run into is that things need to be very high purity. And I think this is one of the issues I ran into using the early, hardware store chemicals, was that they had, different additives in there that were causing interference. The picture to the right, for example, talking about interference, those little circles on the left and the right, I believe those are from tweezers that grabbed the die, and they deposited a very small amount of residue onto the die, and that was enough to completely ruin the reaction on the die and cause lots of problems. So part of the process was finding ways, to develop very high purity, basically, washing a die long instead of picking it up, and just keeping it, no hands on it, nothing like that would cause contamination. Another issue I found was I was using the same beakers for doing the decapping as for the hydrofluoric acid etching. And the problem is that nitric acid will react with copper very readily, which is, present as the lead frame in a lot of these chips. And what this does is it creates this copper nitrate, which then interacts with the hydrofluoric acid to cause a lot of side reactions that will kind of copper plate the die and basically stop this reaction altogether. So use dedicated glassware, and things started working a lot better. Another issue I ran into is, I'm kind of the back alley chip service. I don't exactly have, some sort of high-tech, temperature or humidity control facility. Instead, I'm doing this, basically in the garage, right? And so wide temperature swings, cold in winter, hot in summer. The main component of this dash mixture is acetic acid, basically concentrated vinegar. And one of the very interesting properties about this liquid is that, or solid rather, is that it melts at room temperature. So depending on how you look at it, it's either a solid or a liquid. And this becomes a real problem because if it's not a hot day, this will actually precipitate, cover your die, and actually interfere with the reaction. So the way that I get around this is actually to use a heat gun, just like I was using for maybe decapping or some of the delayering work, and just run it at a slightly elevated controlled temperature so that regardless of whether I run this in summer or winter, I get kind of a repeatable process running at about the same temperature. And below you can see an example of what this looks like when you do it at too cold of a temperature. So even with all this, unfortunately, I still ran into a lot of problems where I would take the exact same process, or it seemed, and I would actually get very different results. Sometimes I would get the mask ROM out, and sometimes I wouldn't. And so after a little bit more research, what I found was that if I lap the die at an angle, which is basically precision polishing, what this will do is it will add kind of a gradient where you can see that the different heights of the transistors, essentially, to see, what is the optimal height that we should be operating at to get the best data retention. And what it showed was you actually want the lower layers of the transistor, which is at the right, to get the best data readout. And the left area of the die just turned completely black. There was no time when it actually showed the data. It just went immediately black, and no real data could be recovered. So kind of an ongoing project is figuring out ways to kind of tune, how far can I dig down in this die reliably to make sure that I get the best data every time. And also, I get a lot of questions about safety, so I thought I'd have a token slide about this. So the hydrofluoric acid is, in fact, not exactly the nicest chemical on the block. So for this project, I actually did purchase a full hazmat suit, which was good because I was able to work with the concentrated hydrofluoric acid, at least with reasonable safety. Fortunately, I don't have to work with that very long. You basically take that, make some weaker solutions, and most of the time you just deal with those. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it off to Marshall.
So at this point, what we have is a bitmap of the mask ROM, which contains the program code for the microcontroller. Now, I mentioned the PIF and the CIC before. They're the two chips that are talking to each other. So here's what they actually look like once you take the lid off. CIC is on the left, PIF is on the right. They actually share the same CPU core. It is called a SM5 core CPU made by Sharp. We didn't know that at first. We just saw a bunch of gates. So we gave the shots to this guy named Seger, who has seen a lot of these Sharp chips before, and he's actually a Sharp guy himself. Sharp as in a lot of stuff up here not working for Sharp. Anyway, he was immediately able to identify that architecture and tell us it's an SM5. It's probably custom. There's all sorts of stuff hanging off of it that you can't immediately know what it's doing, but there you go. So that was our starting point. So, like I said, we have this down in the lower left. That's the ROM image. That is actually what the code that it executes. So using John McMaster's dash etch process, we could figure out what it looked like and then get an image. So once we had the image, which is that big thing on the right, that's the entire mask ROM. It's 8 kilobits, 1 kilobyte of data. Not exactly the hugest thing. It doesn't need to be. So what I did was, instead of trying to go ahead and use OpenCV to, is this a 0 or is it a 1, scan through the entire thing, the quality was not that good. This was actually a process we started in a span, several months, a year and a half, from when you started doing the dash etch to when you were starting to tweak it. So these early images are what I basically worked off of, and I decided I would just do everything by hand. Now, I think this is a pretty good case, or a pretty big argument for just manual entry when you just have to do something once. Like, it only took me 2 days to write this tool, and I slept a lot. So I made it tool in C#. I have a big case of not invented here, so I didn't even look at a lot of the other stuff out there. There is a tool, if you have this same sort of problem, there's a tool out there called ROMPAR, which is a great tool. It lets you figure out the alignment of the grid and then sample along at different points. So if you have cleaner imagery, it's definitely something I would check out. Like I said, I'm Mr. Not Invented here, so I didn't use it. It would probably work for you. So here's my tool. It took me half an hour once I wrote this tool just to punch in all the bits. It lets you set the grid, spacing, it maxes off all the stuff that you don't need to know. It'll actually check to make sure that you typed in everything. So here's just a comparison of the old process versus the most recent process. John's, best work is on the right. So, and that's something that you could probably automatically image, and it would be fine. Here's a block diagram of the CPU. It's a 4-bit CPU. It has 1K of ROM. It has 32 nibbles, not bytes, nibbles of RAM. So that's 16 bytes of RAM, and it has 4 stack levels. So no recursion. Not that you'd have room to do anything anyway. So once we had the architecture somewhat identified, like our friend Seger indicated to us, he said these were actually used in a lot of calculators and stuff like handheld games from the 90s. So we were able to locate about 5 or 6 data sheets that had this information in them. The problem was there was a lot of ambiguity, but I still managed to write a disassembler okay. Just to give you an example, here's a few of the instructions. It's really hard to figure out what you're looking at here. The mnemonics are the same, but it has like 3 different actions that it causes. So, and I'm not good with assembly anyway. So what I did was this middle column at the top is register transfer notation, so you can see what's going on, and then on the right's the branching instructions, so that I can see what's going on. So once we had this disassembly, I worked for a long time, and then that's when Mike actually came in on this project.
So starting from Marshall's disassembly, we were able to get some idea of what the chip did and how it worked, but this was pretty opaque code. I'm not terribly good at reverse engineering, despite giving a talk here, and I'm much more of a debugger type of guy, so I wrote an SM5 emulator based on these data sheets, and we were actually able to run a simulation of this chip pretty effectively, and it's a decent little emulator. It's got a built-in debugger, code and memory breakpoints, memory viewer and editor. Right now, I'm working on undo functionality, since we know that's very important. So this is actually open source. I'm going to have a link to it at the end of the talk. So having the disassembly from Marshall and the emulator, we were able to get an almost complete picture of how the chip actually operates. So at this point, we were able to understand the major phases of execution and be able to interpret some of those logic captures we got off the wire. So to give an overview of how the chip actually works, the second the console turns on, the CIC sends the following data to the PIF. First, it sends a hello and a region ID to identify whether it's a PAL or an NTSC chip. It sends a value called a seed and a checksum. Now, the PIF looks at this data and it decides whether it likes what it sees. At any point in this process, the PIF can decide that it's not going to allow the console to boot and just cause the console to freeze, and the CIC will just sit there waiting forever. If the PIF does like what it sees, it sends the CIC 2 nibbles of data to kind of precede memory, and then both chips enter the main runtime. And this is actually what it looks like on a logic analyzer. You can see the boot, the checksum, and the RAM load all happen in the first second and a half or so after the console starts, and then they enter this main runtime, and this main runtime never stops. So to drill down a little bit into the boot here, you can see the hello and the region ID followed by the seed, but the seed's encoded. We'll get back to that in a little bit. This is how you actually interpret the data. So there are the PIF and the CIC are connected by 2 lines on the cartridge bus. The top line is a clock line that's driven by the PIF, and the bottom line is an open drain line that is driven alternately by the PIF or the CIC. There's no explicit bus arbitration. It's all implicit. They're running pretty similar code, so they know they won't step on each other's toes. And you can see here that the encoded seed in this particular example is BD393D, and we'll talk about what that means in a second. A little zoom in on the checksum here, you can see that it's a bit longer than the seed. And finally, at the very end, you see the 2 nibbles sent from the PIF to the CIC. I'm out of my, all right. So the 2 nibbles sent from the PIF to the CIC. So this is the first time that the PIF actually talks to the CIC and sends any meaningful amount of data. So after the PIF sends those 2 nibbles to the CIC, they enter the main runtime mode. The PIF tells the CIC go into memory compare mode, and they enter memory compare mode. So at this point, we start to see similarities with the earlier SIC chips. Remember that the earlier SIC chips didn't have very much intelligence, the Nintendo and the Super NES. They were two chips that operated in lockstep, and if either chip thought that there was a problem with the data stream, they'd both reset each other. On this chip, on the PIF and the SIC and the SIC both run the same algorithm on the same memory, but they don't do it in lockstep. Instead, they run the algorithm and then they dump the contents of memory and compare each other. So first, the PIF sends its first bit of memory, then the SIC sends its first bit of memory, and on each step, first, the SIC validates that the PIF has sent the correct bit, and then the PIF validates that the SIC has the correct bit. So it's, should I choose the other mic? Okay, so in this case, I'm going to use the other mic. Can you hear? Can you hear me? No, it's on. Sorry, technical difficulties. So by doing this, Nintendo not only made sure that the cartridge in the system was legitimate, they also protected against people from trying to pirate the PIF instead of trying to pirate the SIC, so you can't have a pirate console. So this is a pretty interesting technique. And you can also see here that there's a small delay, I've highlighted it in red, when the SIC sends a 0. The first bit there is the PIF sending a 0, and you can see both the clock and the data line are driven low and high at the same time. However, when the SIC sends a bit, it waits until the data clock goes high before releasing the line. So if you were looking at some unknown chip in the future and you saw some behavior like this, you might be able to deduce from this that it's two chips talking at different times. Finally, at the very end of this, the PIF tells the SIC to go back into the memory compare mode. So it runs this forever until you turn off the console. The party never stops. There is no delay, and if there's ever a single problem, the console locks up. Now, I said that the PIF and the SIC run the same algorithm on the same code. This is what that algorithm looks like. Don't try to get your eyes crossed trying to understand it. It's just garbage. And the point here is that it's essentially security through obscurity. There's no way that you could possibly deduce this algorithm realistically without decapping the chip and extracting the contents of the mask ROM. So it's security through obscurity, but it was effective for about 20 years, which is more than the useful life of the console. So I'm gonna put this in the win column. So we mentioned earlier that there are several variants of the SIC. One of them in particular, the 6105, had a special extra mode just to try to foil the pirates a little bit more. In this mode, the game could actually query the SIC, send it a challenge, and the SIC would send a response. And this is what the code looks like inside the SIC for doing that. It's just another case of security through obscurity. What's interesting to note about this is that a gentleman by the name of Xscale actually was able to take a huge pile of data, because we can log this data, and he was able to reverse engineer the actual algorithm used to generate this without looking at the code. So that was very, very impressive. So at this point in the process, we had the disassembler, we had the emulator, we could get a pretty good interpretation of the data coming over the lines. We still couldn't completely clone the chip. We had a few more hangups. One example here is that the data sheets were not the best data sheets. They had some incompatibilities. For example, you can see in the top one the skip if BL equals 0, and in the second one, skip if result of BL equals FH. So depending on how you implemented these instructions, you could have very drastically different code paths. And now the other thing is, we had this encoded seed in this encoded checksum. So with these data sheets, there was an opcode called DTA, and depending on which data sheet you were looking at, it did something different. For example, in one of the chips, it would drive LCD drivers. In another chip, it would drive analog digital converters. So it seemed to be just sort of a general purpose instruction used to do a chip-specific function. And in this case, we had no idea what this chip-specific function was. However, we could definitely tell looking at the code that it was related to this encoded seed and this encoded checksum. It was loading some data from somewhere, and then that data ended up in memory. then this encoding process happened, and the data got sent over the wire. Interestingly enough, we looked at this encoding algorithm, and I said, hey, it looks like you could probably run that in reverse. So we came up with the inverse algorithm for this, and then based on that data sent over the wire, we could actually decode it and get the contents of that secret data without actually having to understand how this instruction worked. So in the first example, you'd see one chip, when it boots, it sends BD393D, and when you decode it, you get 3F. That's the seed for that particular chip. The next example, the seed is 7878. Interestingly enough, when the system boots, this encryption key, the first two bytes there, or first two nibbles rather, are always B5. The checksum's a little bit more interesting. It's longer for one thing, and then it uses a 4-nibble quote-unquote key. And this value actually varies depending on a delay from the PIF. There's a random period of time that the PIF waits before telling the SIC, okay, send me the checksum. And that is just based off of the RC circuit delay from a capacitor that hangs off of this chip. So finally, with all of this, we actually were able to completely clone the chip. So in order to test this, I had this guy over here who's an Altium Pro put together a PCB. Do you want to talk about the PCB, Marshall?
Yeah, as you can see, I am a total PCB expert. All it does is it adapts about 4 pins from the SIC footprint to the, we used a PIC microcontroller, it's a PIC 16F something or other. So as you can see, that PCB is very, very compliant to everything. So if you use, ROHS or lead-free solder, you're fine. You're compliant for all cases. So anyway, that was our basically our test bed for the first few chips.
So I'm going to go ahead and run a video of this thing booting, and apologize in advance. The video quality is not the best. I looked around my house for anything that accepted composite in that wasn't also mounted to a wall, and this studio monitor is the best I could come up with. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is boot Banjo-Tooie, and as you can see, the game actually successfully boots. And this is one of those games that uses the 6105 chip. It won't even boot if you haven't implemented the 6105 challenge response algorithm correctly.
Actually, this game, it encrypts all of its game assets, and it uses the response as a decryption key, so it decrypts itself at runtime. So the way they actually emulate this on a computer is to just capture all the responses as someone plays through the entire game, because there are over several hundred responses that you have to know.
Actually, an interesting side note about that, after Xscale was able to reverse engineer this algorithm, he regenerated the list of all the challenges and responses, and it turned out that there was somebody fat-fingered one of the responses in the file. So after Banjo-Tooie boots, we just had a guy by name of Arbin play through this game 100%, and he just finished playing it 100% last night, and he did not run into any problems whatsoever. So we're very confident that our SIC clone is working 100% effectively. So after that game finishes, interesting, it does have sound. So just for completeness, we also went ahead and booted another game with another SIC. This is using our little adapter board that I can show you after the talk. This is just booting Star Fox, and again, I've left this game running overnight, and it never stops and never seems to cause any problems. So we're pretty confident in our code. Oops, that looks close enough. I'm bad at computers. Sorry, guys. If I hit Control Q, is it going to quit PowerPoint? Sorry, I've only been a Mac user for a couple weeks now. Marshall, tell a joke.
Put me on the spot here. Wow. Well, I see a joke on the stage here.
Ooh, wow. I was going to buy you a beer, but nope.
It's all right. He can take it.
All right, so that was our demo. I wasn't going to lug a Nintendo 64 from the States here to show it, but In any case, really? All right. In any case, so some of the features of our clone chip is it's actually region-free. I discovered a technique for making it able to boot in either the PAL or the NTSC region. I'm not releasing that code, but I am releasing a bare-bones version of this code, open source. So there's going to be a GitHub link at the end if you want to check out my really awesome 8-bit pick assembly. Go nuts, man. I never want to look at that architecture again. Funny thing about PIC, it's pretty terrible. But for this particular microarchitecture, it had some nice features that made implementing this stuff pretty easier than it could have been otherwise. Remember, we mentioned that this is a 4-bit microcontroller. So when you've got things like carry, it all depends on not carry in the 8th bit, it's carry in the 4th bit. PIC actually has a feature called decimal carry. So if the 4th bit carries, there's a flag in the status register. So we were able to actually implement the code in a pretty straightforward manner, not having to think too hard about 4-bit math versus 8-bit math. We ran into an interesting problem with a PIF. So the CPU clock for the CIC is around 1.6 to 2 megahertz, and the internal logic of the chip actually runs at half that speed. So we wired up a PIC to the same clock, and we thought, great, we're going to have twice as many instructions to actually implement the same thing, because we'll be running at the full external clock speed. Well, fun fact about 8-bit PICs, they actually run at 1/4 the external clock speed. So we had half as many instructions. That didn't work out. Luckily, Microchip makes a pin-compatible part to the one we originally spec'd, and it has an internal 4x PLL. So we were able to get around that. So I guess you win some, you lose some with PIC. All right, last but not least, I definitely want to mention some related work. We spent about two and a half years working on this, and in the meantime, at least one other independent effort came about to reverse engineer this chip. So a German team led by 2 guys named Marcus wrote a paper called Breaking This Integrated Circuit Device Security, yada yada. They found a factory test mode on this chip. They like we did, they decapped the chip and optically imaged it. They traced out some of the logic on the chip and found that there was actually a factory test mode. And so they found that they were actually able to perform arbitrary code execution on this chip. And so using their technique, we could actually start to understand what some of these unknown instructions did and run some code on the chip. So once again, PCB Pro over here made us a board.
It's a very nice board. I like it. I made it last year, so it's not that out of date anymore.
And so this board has a footprint for a SIC on here, and also has the ability to burn PICs. It slices, it dices. And so this was plugs into an FPGA board there, and we were able to clock some code into it and run arbitrary code. Using this technique, we were able to extract the mask ROM using code and validate that our image that we obtained optically was bit for bit identical to the image, and it turns out it was. So that was really great to find out that our technique was very effective.
So one of the other things I'm working on that's also related to Nintendo 64 is an HDMI converter that upscales the signal. So I needed a way to be able to update the firmware for that in the field. So I thought, okay, you just make yourself a custom game, you put in the Nintendo, it boots, and then it reflashes everything. So this is one of the biggest use cases that I can see right off for this SIC clone chip, is that you just put on there, it costs like 70 cents, and then you can make like scads of these things and not have to worry about getting them back. So you're not dependent on scavenging stuff from older games.
So we'll talk a little bit about the future work. We also, John decapped and imaged the PIF, the more advanced chip that lives on the Nintendo 64, and John traced out some of the logic on that chip and found the same 2 test pins that Marcus and Marcus had identified. So we strongly suspect that the internal test mode is present on this chip. We did extract the the ROM image optically, but when we tried to interpret it, we ran into some weird problems. So I think for future work, we're going to try to identify the bus that actually you clock the data in and out. So this was some stuff that you did, Marshall.
Right. I took the die image that John made, and I went around the periphery of the chip where the inputs and outputs are, and I tried to catalog what nets were driving what pins, and it turns out some pins were only driven or drove one net, which a net is basically a signal. So around the outside the periphery of the chip there, you'll see the pin number, the function of the chip, and then this blue number. And the blue number is the number of nets that I/O driver has. So if you look at the top right corner, you'll see 666, 36364, and then those are a lot higher than the ones on the bottom left. So I'm thinking that these pins have alternate functionality, just like the CIC, and that we could use them for arbitrary code execution. Now, this is future work. We just discovered this like a week ago. But we're really hoping we could run our own code on this chip. This has its own 1K ROM as well, but it's actually fully utilized, unlike the CIC that is basically half empty.
So yeah, we have some interesting ideas about how we might find those pins. So if you want to talk to us after the talk about that, I'd be happy to. That's pretty much all we got for you today. Give out some thanks. Marcus and Marcus very graciously helped us out. Seger, who is crazy smart, Zunkity as well, helped a lot on this project. I think nobody knows more about how the Nintendo 64 boots than he does. MuKitted out in Australia helped a lot with the PAL testing. Arbin and Jura, who are running through games and making sure that they continue running so that when we release this to the public, they will be solid as a rock. Shout outs to some friends on the internet. N64 Dev, Pinchy, Lack, Xscale, Nico Jovis, rest in peace. Andrew, thanks for everything. And with that, we'll open it up to any questions. And these are our contacts and stuff.
Do you have one you can use? All right, sweet.
Awesome talk, you guys. Hey, you can't see me, but I'm going to ask you a question. So from what I understand, the NES CIC had this hack that you could lift one of the pins and just ground it, and that would disable the CIC in the console. So any game, any pirated games, you could just run on it. Did you notice anything with the N64 CIC, either by looking through the code or like figuring out something else that an easier way to bypass this whole thing if you could, modify the console?
Well, like I said, the PIF is what you got to worry about, and it lives inside the console, and it does all the system bring up, and it does handle all the resets and NMIs for the MIP CPU, and it pulls the controllers and all that stuff. So basically, yeah, you can blow that away and replace it with your own. You'll have to lift some copyrighted code bootloader out of there, put it in your new one, and then replicate all this functionality.
It's not a practical approach, but if we get the PIF code, maybe there's a hidden mode where the CIC can tell it, hey, just stop bugging me and let it run forever.
Is this off now? Is this on? Yeah, technical difficulties here too. Okay, so really they're almost solving that problem just by hiding it inside of more silicon.
They're hiding it inside much more complex silicon.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Over there. Take a moment to say that I really enjoy video games.
Hey, so when you guys approached the dash etching for the PIF and SIC, you guys had a bunch of cartridges you can just buy for 50 cents each. But how did you approach dash etching the chip in the console where you only had like a couple of them? Or did you guys just sacrifice like 20 N64s?
So at that point, I had already developed the process for the 6102, and the process on the PIF was very similar. So I was able to just say, okay, look, these chips are made on the same process. It's going to require the same recipe. So it really wasn't that big of a deal to get the process working on the PIF once it was working on the SIC.
I think we have more questions here in the front. Saw a hand over here. It's a miracle I can see anything up here.
Oh, hi. So the modern EverDrive's boot, how does that work? And are you going to share this stuff with the EverDrive guy?
So the clone of the SIC is open source. So if he wants to use that, he can. Currently, as far as I know, they're using just the same technique that the 64 drive uses, which is an actual chip inside the console, or original Nintendo SIC. So, yeah.
All right. Any more questions? We got one more.
Oh. I think this is the most questions I've ever gotten from a talk.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a last-minute question. I know the old CIC had like an unusual 4-bit polynomial instruction counter. I was curious if there were any hardware quirks of the N64 CIC that are similar.
Aside from just being a 4-bit microcontroller, it was pretty vanilla. It had a regular linear counter, nothing all that out of the ordinary.
Yeah, because I've seen the reversing efforts for the previous CIC, but I was always curious how they had, manually reversed that polynomial instruction counter and gone through the code for reversing.
That's 100% Seger. He's one of those people who you just like, all right, you're crazy smart. Just take this and do your thing. All right, I think that's it.